Imagine for a moment a postman walking his route on your street. But it's not long before you notice that I am not your regular postman, delivering the mail you might normally expect. You see, I deliver stories, tales of the grim and mysterious in particular. Ghosts and shadows haunt these pages, some inspired by true stories, others entirely from my own mind. And if you decide you're brave enough to see what I've delivered today, well, I warned you. The Pale Man. This happened when I was in high school, and I still can't think about it too much even nowadays. We lived in a 2-story house with a finished basement growing up. On this particular night, my family was upstairs in bed, and I had fallen asleep in the basement watching TV. To understand the setting better, I need to describe the layout of our basement. The stairs were on the back wall, about a room's length away from the back side of the couch. Near those stairs was a Pirates of the Caribbean-themed clock that my dad had bought and hung there on the back wall. The clock had a red neon light built in that encircled the diameter of the clock, and when all the other lights were off down there, the red light from the neon would fill the basement with a dim red glow. It wasn't enough to see every detail of the basement, but it was enough to see most things. The TV was in the far corner of the room, next to the sliding glass door that went outside. The couch I was asleep on was facing this door, away from the clock. I had been down there for most of the night, and it was now creeping into the very early hours of the morning. Our TV had an automatic timer on it that made it turn off after a couple hours, so now the only light in the room was the steady red glow of the clock. I remember that I woke up for no reason that I can think of. No loud noises, no bad dream. I just opened my eyes. I didn't even sit up. The first thing I noticed, of course, was that I had accidentally fallen asleep on the couch again, which was nothing new. Then my eyes began to scan the room. They started at the blank screen of the TV as I tried to recall what I had conked out watching. Then they moved downward toward the sliding glass door. Then they froze on something. Something that was definitely an unfamiliar aspect of my parents' basement. There was a tall figure standing next to the sliding door. The door had 2 long curtains that were pulled to each side of it, and at first I thought that maybe my eyes were confusing the curtain for a person standing there. But as I focused, I soon realized that there was most definitely a person cloaked in what looked like a black hoodie standing in front of the curtain, looking at me. I thought that maybe it was one of my brothers at first, trying to prank me or something. But my body seemed paralyzed, unable to move. I suppose because deep down, I could tell that there was something unnatural about this thing. I tried to make out its features in the darkness, with only the glow of the clock as an aid, but I couldn't see too many details. What I did see shook me. I could tell that there was a pale face beneath the hood, with very sharp features. It had high cheekbones and dark eyes that I knew for sure were there because the red of the clock's light was reflecting off of them. I could feel that the eyes were locked on me. I thought that maybe this was just a dream, and so I closed my eyes tight to see if the next time I opened them, I would actually wake up and the figure would be gone. I waited for a moment. Then, as I began to tremble, I opened them. The figure was gone, but not just that. When I opened my eyes, the whole room was gone. All I could see was darkness. I didn't even see the red glow of my dad's clock. I blinked a couple times, hoping my eyes would adjust, but they didn't. Then I realized why everything was black, and I very slowly turned my head upward. The figure that was standing against the door on the front wall had somehow, without a sound, moved to where it was standing right next to me. I now found myself looking up into its shrouded face as it stood there looking down, just as still as it had been before. Without knowing what else to do, I shut my eyes tight again and could only think to pray one thing. "In the name of Jesus, get away," I whispered to myself in a shaky voice. Then, after a minute more of silence, I opened my eyes again, and this time, I was once again alone in the basement. I stayed awake after that, and I'm still not exactly sure what I saw then, so many years ago. But the feeling I had in my soul that night was telling me it was something demonic, and I pray I never experience anything like that again. Another thing to note, and I assume the two events are related, but my dad had accidentally left his cell phone on the TV stand, right next to where the figure had been standing. After finding it the next morning, he told me that for some reason his phone had dialed 3 outgoing calls to my grandma at 3 in the morning. It had never done anything like that before or since. Trespassing. This story happened probably 70 or so years ago, when my great-grandpa had purchased the land their house still sits on to this day. They had bought an old farmhouse which sat far off in the woods by itself. The farm had a couple small barns on the property, and one of them was used as a little dairy barn, where the previous owners would milk their cows. My great-grandpa had begun the long and tedious process of moving stuff around to figure out what he wanted to either keep or add to his ever-growing burn pile he had out back, and had made his way from the tiny house that sat in the front of the property to the barns in the back. It was around mid-morning when he began going through things in the old dilapidated dairy barn. There hadn't been any cows in that barn for quite a few years, but the mess they left was still there, and my great-grandpa definitely had his work cut out for him. There was a big pile of old lumber in front of one of the gates inside the barn, and since it was right in the way, he decided that that was what he would go through first. He had only just begun picking up some boards and organizing them into piles when he heard a sound in the far corner of the barn, where one of the gates opened up into an outside pasture behind the building. I don't remember exactly what the sound was that he heard, but it was quick, I know that, and it was clearly suspicious enough for my great-grandpa to pause a moment and look in that direction. After a quick minute of looking, he decided it was nothing and continued on his work. However, only a moment had passed before he heard another sound, and this one I remember. My great-grandpa said he most assuredly heard a child's quick laugh come from one of the back rooms of the old dairy barn, and it was loud enough to make him drop the piece of lumber he was holding in that moment. "Who's in there?" he called out into the big dark area, filled with old farm and tractor tools. He said there was no answer, and so he walked back to investigate. The only light was a few sunbeams coming in through the cracks in the old corrugated metal roof, but it was enough for him to be able to walk one round through the room to be pretty sure there were no kids hiding in there. As he walked around, he also shouted that if anybody was in there, they were trespassing, and then he threatened them by letting them know he would get his shotgun from in the house and come back out if they didn't leave, but there was no movement. I'm sure my great-grandpa was less than satisfied with his findings, as he was sure he heard a laugh, but he supposed it was nothing to worry about, and after a while he continued doing his work. But he had only been back at it for maybe 2 or 3 minutes when, out of nowhere, my great-grandpa saw a small boy suddenly run out from one of the barn's small cow stalls. The ones that he had seen were empty when he first walked into the building, and sprint past him, giggling. The boy ran out the front door of the dairy barn. My great-grandpa dropped what he was doing and ran out after him. But when he got outside, there was no one there. There was nowhere the boy could have hidden right outside of the dairy barn, and he wasn't running fast enough to have gotten anywhere else quick enough. He just seemed to vanish. My great-grandpa met with the previous owners of the property later on, basically to tell them that they had better tell their kids to stay out of his barn now that it was his property. But what they told him then, he would never forget. The previous owners had sold all their cows because a long time ago they had a son. The boy was very young, too young to be in the dairy barn by himself with the livestock, and basically what had happened was his parents' worst nightmare. He had gotten too close to one of the cows they owned, and unfortunately it had kicked him about as hard as a cow can kick. The boy was severely injured, and he passed away only minutes later, in my great-grandpa's dairy barn, which is still standing to this day. A knocking sound. My family had just gotten home from running errands in town, but my dad was working late that night. It was late in the year, so it was already after dark by the time my mom had brought us home. She had my siblings helping her put away groceries upstairs while she told me to take a bag of water softener salt down to the mechanical room in the basement where the water softener and furnace were. There was another room in the basement just down the hall from the mechanical room, and that was my dad's weight room where he had his exercise equipment and a bunch of his comic books that he had collected. After groaning to my mom about why I had to be the one to haul the heavy bag of salt down the stairs and being threatened with a spanking, I picked up the bag and hobbled cautiously down the stairs so as to not lose my footing and fall. I turned on the basement light and walked into the mechanical room with the bag over my shoulder. After opening the door, I plopped the bag down hard on the ground, not really caring if a hole got torn in it or not. It was when I closed the mechanical room door that I first heard it. There was a heavy knocking sound coming from down the hall. At first I thought it might be somebody in my family upstairs banging around, but after listening a moment longer, I realized that it was definitely coming from the end of the hallway in the basement. There wasn't really a pattern to it. There would be 5 or so knocks, then a pause, then 2 knocks, then a pause, then 3 knocks, etc., etc. I opened the mechanical room door again to see if maybe it was the furnace making the sound or something, and maybe the basement was just throwing the sound around. But all was still, except for the usual hums and groans of the appliances in there. I closed the door again and decided to investigate, because the more I listened to the knocking, the more it didn't sound like something produced by the house. It was sounding more and more like somebody was in my dad's workout room, banging on something. I took a few careful steps down the hallway, drawing closer and closer to my dad's weight room door, which was closed tight. When I got right in front of it, I was 100% sure that the knocking was coming from just beyond that door. It continued loud as I stood there, with the same random pattern as before. It had been going on several minutes now. I wondered if maybe my dad had come home from work after all, and that maybe he was just down in his weight room and started working on something. But when I looked down at the crack at the bottom of the door, I could see pretty clearly that the light inside was off. Not to mention that I was sure my dad's work truck was not in the driveway when we had pulled in from running errands. I put my ear against the door and listened. The knocking went on just as loud as ever. Whatever was doing it was not banging on the door directly, but it sounded like it was happening just on the other side, and high up, like it might be coming from the ceiling. Suddenly, the knocking sound stopped. I waited a moment, then clutched the brass doorknob in my hand. Turning it, I cracked the door open, peeking inside. Then slowly I pushed it open the rest of the way. There were no windows in that room, obviously, since it was in the basement, and my dad had painted the block walls pitch black, so it was as dark could be in there. The only light was the bulb hanging from the hallway ceiling, which barely made it through the door. I scanned the room but saw mostly darkness. But what little I could see didn't seem that out of the ordinary. I was about to close the door when suddenly there was one more knock from above me, and it was louder than all the rest I had heard. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but before I had too much time to react, a black figure fell from the ceiling right in front of me, smacking into the floor mere inches from my feet. I screamed, slamming the door hard and running as fast as I could back down the hallway and up the stairs. The first thing I did was tell my mom what had happened, as she was still putting away groceries. She told me she would go back down to the basement and take a look. I stood next to her, absolutely petrified, as she opened the door to the weight room. She reached a hand in and flipped on the light switch. There was nothing on the floor, and there was no knocking from anywhere in the room.